Professor Malbin, your paper includes a very compelling discussion of how changes in the primary calendar for presidential candidates, which you called front-loading, put in unanticipated pressure on the design of the presidential public funding system, helping to make it far less of a benefit. You're careful also to provide many examples of occasions in which the program also provided a crucial boost to competitors and even to some eventual frontrunners who were not ahead in the money race early on. I wondered if you would take a minute just to expand on some of the observations in that part of your paper and to go through some of that history for us.
Thank you for reading the paper.
Homework, check.
I thought it was interesting to go through, and there were claims made, and I was partly writing against those who said that public financing really didn't make much of a difference in competition. It was all about some other things, and it was actually stifling competition. And I just decided to take a look at okay, which candidates didn't have money when they were dark horses running against frontrunners. And the simple list in this paper, if you pick it up on page 5, Ronald Reagan was dead meat in January of 1976, running against an incumbent president until he got public funds. Jimmy Carter was also. George H.W. Bush was running against the front runner, was totally out of money. We're talking about two people who would not have been viable candidates 4 years later and never would have been president of the United States without public funds. I thought it was also useful to point out that this tends to suggest that it's not a pro-democratic party program. The other candidates who were like this, we're talking about people who had less than $100,000 facing frontrunners who had $1 million at that time or more, multi-millions. Gary Hart, Jesse Jackson, Paul Tsongas, Pat Buchanan, then John McCain, and in 2004, John Edwards, Wesley Clark, Richard Gephardt. None of these people would have, and John Edwards this time around, none of them would have had a chance to bring their case before the public had they not had an infusion of public funds. That is to say, this very clearly helped second-tier candidates over the decades. And what happened, and what has happened to make the program less relevant, is that the campaign finance system is a system designed to serve other systems. It's not standing out there all by itself. Candidates have to devise their strategies given the rules of whatever election they're in the case of presidential primaries, most decisively affected by the calendar. As primaries moved forward, candidates had to have enough money to go up against the frontrunner, not only in Iowa, but in this case, whatever was going to be the next tier of candidates before you could raise the next round of money. Jimmy Carter had, 5 weeks between Iowa and New Hampshire, and the campaign ended in June, and Ronald Reagan didn't lose to Gerald Ford until August. Now there are 5 days between Iowa and New Hampshire, and half of the delegates are chosen within 5 weeks instead of 3 months. So if you have to raise your money early in order to face that kind of a calendar, you remember the one I put up earlier about until you are known, you don't get to do small donors? It meant that you had to raise the bulk of your money looking at a potential $100 million opposition before you have momentum. So it tended to, you look at the numbers over the years, and candidates went more and more for the $1,000 contributors. There is an interplay between other aspects of the process, campaign finance. This system was designed after only 1 year of a primary-dominated system. It was designed for 1976. The first primary-dominated election was 1972. It is outmoded. And the fact that it is outmoded because other aspects of the system changes tells you absolutely nothing about whether public financing per se is outmoded.
So I wanted to solicit some comments from Mr. Eisen, Mr. Hoppen, or Reverend Yearwood that might help us understand more clearly the role, the intersection here between what was going on online and what was happening in terms of the person-to-person organizing effort.
As I said, there were frustrations with how well that was working and just the cost of building really a 21st century online operation, which is not inconsiderable. But then once we picked up momentum, once we had the breakthrough in Iowa, that really did work. So you would get, instant feedback. You'd have people sign up on Tuesday on the internet, and Wednesday they would be knocking on doors. And conversely, we would go door to door in Iowa, and we'd fill out these pledge cards. And the youngsters would stay. We'd bring them back at the end of the day, come straggling in at 8, 9 o'clock with these cards. And the youngsters would stay there and enter that data. They would update it, and all those people would be on our email list by the time we came back the next morning. And then you'd go back. We went back to some of these doors 2 and 3 times, say, oh, I've started getting emails from you. So we attempted to construct a virtuous cycle, and now thinking about ways to do that in government as well.
Mm-hmm. Reverend Yearwood, did you want to add anything?
No, definitely. I think it's important. It's important to note that a lot of communities now are facing that institutional void, and so a lot of them are not in the churches or the mosques or the synagogues or in the unions. Or community centers, and so within that, the offline online component is very critical particularly for the generations who were born in the 80s, 70s, and even to some degree the 60s as well. And so the offline online process is critical because it actually creates an institution to some degree. Mm-hmm. It actually creates a place where they can almost gather. So where you used to do these things in a church or a synagogue or a mosque, but you used to do this thing at a community center. The offline online community actually has now, in essence, created its own institution, which is very important, but also very scary. One of the things we say mentioned about YouTube. That's obviously our generation. We said the revolution may not be televised; it will be uploaded. So So I just want to say that that's a very important piece. Let me just say one thing that I didn't mention was the Fair Elections Now Act, which is in the House. It's H.R. 1826. But I just wanted to mention one of the key things why this is so important with the offline-online component. It changes the paradigm. It goes from a small number of large donors to a large numbers of small donors. So there's a paradigm shift. I want to make sure, so the offline-online process enforces and promotes more of the large numbers of small, because then obviously that makes it so that I just can't sit up here and find 4 white guys to give me some money and run an election, and then you go out there and find all of you, and I'm just the guy who wins because I just found 4 guys who got a lot of money. You then, because you've gotten all of you together and done small donors, so if you have done encompassed that, I then am now forced out of that model. So I just can't wear the fur coat in Iowa and show up, which is the old model. Me just coming up here, finding a candidate who looks good, but behind him is just 4 money people. You now have then gone out and you have now touched this entire audience and gotten each one to give you up to $100. You now become the one who changes, and then you now become the one who has the power to change our process.
I just want to add that Lennox has more credibility on this because when you were doing all your Twitter speak, he knew what you were talking about.
And was twittering, actually. Trying to, at least.